Well, believe it or not, I started, it was 10 weeks ago. Started, well, 10 sermons ago. I didn't preach the last 2 weeks, but so it's 12 weeks ago that I started a series, Who is This Jesus? And I plan to take us through the New Testament looking at who Jesus is. I mean, we talk about him, we say we love him, we say that we read his word and all that, but do we really know who he is? Do we know the Jesus who walked on the face of this earth? And I want to spend some time doing that. But as I started to prep for this, I came across a passage in John where it says that, where Jesus is speaking, he says, I am the shepherd. I am the good shepherd. And I thought, well, okay, who is this Jesus? He is the good shepherd. Well, that week I happened to also be going to a funeral. And it was a funeral. The person was not a believer, but they were reciting the Lord's. They were reciting Psalm 23. And I thought, why does that psalm bring comfort? Why do we use Psalm 23 as a psalm for funerals? It's not a psalm about funerals. It's a psalm about the Lord is my shepherd, and I shall have no want. So why do we read it at funerals? And I began to think about that. And so I embarked on this study. I thought, well, I'll start the Who is This Jesus series with Psalm 23. And I figured I'd do it in maybe 2 weeks. Well, here we are at week 10. And today we're going to be looking at, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So let's read Psalm 23 as I do each and every week. Psalm 23 says this, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The Psalms are filled with a longing to abide in the presence of God and in his house. I want to give you just a few other passages. Psalm 26, verse 8 says this, I love the house where you live, O Lord, the place where your glory dwells. Psalm 27, verse 4, one thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. And then Psalm 84 says this, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are ever praising you. Continually talking about the presence of God. Continually talking about dwelling in his house. That's the same longing for life with God in the house of God is what concludes our study in probably one of the best known passages in all the Bible. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This should be the cry of every one of us. This should be the pinnacle of every Christian's life, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever. How did David get to this point? How did David get to the point where he said, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever? What is it that fueled this desire in the life of David? Well, David had an understanding of God's character. A clear understanding of God's character. Where did he get that? He knew the stories. He knew the stories of the Old Testament scriptures. He knew about God redeeming his people, the Israelites, and how he brought them out of captivity and into dwelling with him. We've been going over that in our Sunday school study. Study of Exodus chapter 14. The Red Sea rules. The same God who led you in will lead you out. David knew that. David experienced that himself. Exodus 15 says this, in your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. God, you're going to lead the people that you've redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. all the way to heaven. Exodus 15:17. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, your hands established. Israel has been redeemed, has been delivered from Egypt for one reason: to dwell with God. Those are his people, and he wanted his people dwelling with him. David understood that his desire to dwell with God, that by building a temple, you remember David's desire to build a temple, it was so small and insignificant compared to God's desire to dwell with his people. As much as the psalmist and the Psalms talk about the desire for us or for those particular people to dwell in the presence of God, God's desire is to dwell with us even more. It's greater than any desire we can come up with. And David also gained a better understanding of God through the experiences of his own life. He had challenges all through his life, some serious ones. He did experience victory over Goliath, but then he also experienced the hatred of King Saul. Saul wanted him dead, and he was doing anything he could to pursue him and kill him. David enjoyed the favor and goodness of God, but he also experienced the discipline of God after his sin with Bathsheba. He experienced victory in all of his battles, and he was well respected by all. But his son Absalom wanted his throne, and he even wanted his dad dead, his son. Sorrows, joys, journeying, rest, peace, struggles, all of this pointed to an end and an interpretation as God was preparing David for the end. In spite of all this, in spite of all that David went through, he was convinced that the day was coming when he would dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Before David came to this conviction, he did a little reflecting. And we read of that in Psalm 23. You remember he's writing from the perspective of a sheep and a shepherd. And David is thinking about the previous activities of his life. He begins to recount the blessings of the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd provided that he could lie down in green pastures where he could eat and rest. He brought him to still and pleasing waters where he could be refreshed. He restored his soul. When David is about to cave and to just give up, God restored his soul. He led him in paths of righteousness. David remembered that he strengthened him when he was weak and could go no further. He remembered that God protected him. He remembered that God prepared a table for him to eat at in the presence of his enemies. As he was in the middle of his enemies, in the middle of attacks, God prepared a table for him where he could sit and eat and not worry about the enemies. David looked back on his God and he remembers all these things. See, we get the table in the wilderness here where we can sit, eat, and even rest in the presence of our enemies. But he's also anointed his head with oil. He said, my cup overflows. Has your cup overflowed? When you think back about all the things that God has done in your life, has your cup overflowed? Are you overwhelmed with God's goodness? What about you? Let's talk about you. I look around the auditorium here and I see people that have gone through some pretty tough stuff. I also see some people that have gone through some pretty great stuff. Is your cup overflowing with joy because of what he's done in your life? I mean, I've had the responsibility of doing funerals for some of your loved ones, coming to the bedsides of those that are sick. Some difficult things. We talked about the providential hand of God this morning in Sunday school. Have you seen his hand at work in your life? Have you seen his hand at work in the lives of your loved ones? Does your cup overflow? because of his goodness and mercy that has followed you all the days of your life. By means of all the mercies that God bestowed on David, he became convinced and persuaded of the ongoing favor of God to him, to the point where he declared, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Sometimes I don't think that we as Christians are confident of this, that we will see the goodness of God today. Oh, yeah, heaven's out there somewhere, it's out in the distance. But what about today? You see the goodness and mercy of God today. Do you see his hand at work in your life today? We live like we just have to get through this day. Think about it. If we can only make it to the weekend, if I can make it to the weekend, it'll be an awesome week. We live in a constant state of martyrdom and woe is me. Why don't we talk about and even boast about the goodness of God in our own lives? Why is that not something that's on the forefront of our minds? Why is that not something that's at the beginning of every one of our conversations? The goodness and mercy of God that you and I enjoy every day. We should be happy to talk about and describe in detail our hard experiences and how God brought us through it. We like to talk about the tough stuff. We like to talk about, the aches and pains. It's funny, last weekend we were at the wedding of our daughter. That's a pretty good reason for me not to be here last Sunday, isn't it? Excused absence, everybody? Yeah, Paul walked out, so. But we were at the wedding of our daughter, and a couple of our college friends, like Craig Sanders that you guys have been praying for, he and his wife were there. You know what we talked about? The good old days and our aches and pains of today. I said, I remember saying, I will never do that. And here we are talking about our aches and our pains. Why not talk about God's deliverance through those aches and pains and his goodness to us? Why not celebrate that? We should be eager to talk about our confidence in Jesus. Psalm 118:24, I read about this morning. I mentioned it at the close of Sunday school. This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. I will. I can come up with all kinds of reasons why not. But I will rejoice and be glad in it. Why? Because surely goodness and mercy has followed me all the days of my life. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, it's pretty easy to read this psalm for the blessings found in verses 1 through 3 and for the promise found in verse 6. But what about when we're not quite sure if the green pastures that we are going to be laying in is not the Amazon jungle with the valley of shadow of death right behind it? What about then? He is the good shepherd who provides for us spiritually and physically. And even though we're prone to wander, the good shepherd leads us in paths of righteousness. But in verse 4, we find ourselves entering the valley of the shadow of death. You remember we talked about that. It's a shadow. And a shadow cannot hurt you. It can't touch you. It's a shadow. But it can be scary. What does David do? He remembers and he recounts the goodness of the Good Shepherd. David says this, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. How could he do that? Because goodness and mercy have been following him all along. I will fear no evil. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. I can recount times when I remember that God's rod and his staff have guided me in the paths of righteousness. And if I know that God's rod is there to protect me, I can rest. I can fear no evil. He's prepared a table before me in the presence of my enemies. When everything's out of control, when everything's going haywire, God says, come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Come and sit at the table and enjoy a meal. Oh yeah, that stuff's going on out there, but you know what? My rod and staff are right here in my hand, and you got nothing to worry about. Is it scary? Yeah, it can be scary. When you start looking at the stuff that's going on around you, yeah, it can be scary. But if the good shepherd's there with his rod and his staff, and if you can look back and you can see how his goodness and mercy have followed you all the days of your life, and if you can, with David, rejoice in the fact that I will enjoy the presence of God, I will dwell in the house of God forever, what in the world we got to worry about? You anoint my head with oil. What does that mean? You remember we went over that? Well, the shepherds had all kinds of pests and things like that. And they would anoint the shepherd, the good shepherd would put an oil on the heads of the sheep to keep the parasites and all that away. What has God done? God has given us his word to anoint our heads, and he's given us his spirit to continue anointing our heads. See, David can't help but talk about it. He says, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. His life here is all taken care of. It's all taken care of. David is so sure of this that just a few chapters later in Psalm 27:13, he says, I am still confident of this. Now get it. Understand this. David was under attack. And he says this, I am still confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. See, we always say, well, we got to live this life here, and I'll work my way through it, but heaven's around the corner. Yes, heaven's around the corner. But here's what David says, I will still see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. What are you looking for? Are you looking for goodness and mercy? Because it's there. If you look for it, you'll find it because it's there. Same God who led him beside still waters and into the green pastures is with him in the valley too. The only difference is that now the good shepherd has the rod and the staff to protect him and guide him. As they're going in the valley, the rod and the staff have come out to make sure that they're guided along the path where they need to go. Here's something we need to remember. God is not taking less care of his sheep in the valley. In fact, he's taking even greater care. David then looks beyond the valley of the shadow of death to what will follow. He realizes that no matter how he may leave the valley, he knows that God will be with him. No matter how I may end up coming out of this valley, whether I walk out or somebody has to carry me out, God is going to be with me. If David lives, he also knows that goodness and mercy is going to follow him all the days of his life. Allow me to remind you of something that the Apostle John saw with his own eyes, his own two eyes. Turn with me to Revelation chapter 21. You've heard people say, well, the good thing about Christians is in the end we win. I want you to hear this. Revelation 21. Let's start at verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven. Now this is John talking about what he saw when he was taken up to heaven. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Now get this. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. You can take it to the bank. In Psalm 23, David sets forth the hope of dwelling in the house of the Lord forever in two ways. First, God's house is portrayed as the end of the journey for his people. David's portrayed the Lord as his shepherd throughout his life. He understood the responsibility of a shepherd because he was a shepherd himself. David's expectation was so sure because of being a shepherd himself, he knew that the arrival to the home pasture was not the responsibility of the sheep. Responsibility of getting the sheep from the upper highlands back to the home pasture was not the responsibility of the sheep. The sheep were fearful. They were wayward. They were dumb. The guidance and care and protection of the sheep was the responsibility of the shepherd. That's how he knew he was going to spend all of the days of his life in the house of the Lord, because he knew who the shepherd was. He knows who the shepherd is. The shepherd who says, you will spend all the days of your life in my house, can actually do it. You don't have to wonder. There's nothing depending on you. David knows that the good shepherd is faithful, and he will do what he says and promises to do. Second, God's house is presented as the beginning of eternal glory. God has allowed us, if you think about it, to taste the delights and joys of his house in this life. When you gather with the people of God and worship, that's a taste. That's a taste of what it's going to be like in the house of God. The Lord has also on many occasions spread out a table for us in our times of wilderness. But as good as some of these things are, and as awesome as they have been, as special as they are just foretastes of the feasting that God has prepared for us in his house forever. Our journey's end is also the new beginning of a supremely blessed life in the presence of God and his people for all eternity. I don't know if you've ever sat down and tried to imagine what the Garden of Eden must have been like, or even try to think of what heaven's going to be like. You can't come close. You cannot come close. Our journey's end and eternity's beginning are really, in many ways, a coming home. If you're a Christian, it's a coming home. It's a homecoming. We will be led by the Good Shepherd into the streets of heaven, and we will do so with joy that's inexpressible and thanksgiving like you've never experienced before. If you're a Christian, you will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I want you to really get a hold of that. You will see David and the various psalmists there. You'll see your loved ones who are Christians and who have gone before you there. But better than anything else, you're going to see Jesus, the Good Shepherd. It's all because of Jesus and God. It's all because of Jesus and the fact that God has given us a picture of that. As Israelite pilgrims made their annual journey to Solomon's temple, it served as a symbol for God's ultimate purpose to dwell with his people. You know, the annual pilgrimage of the Jews to the temple is a picture. It's a picture for us to be able to look back on and learn from. The interesting thing is that at the entrance to the house of God, there was an altar. And that altar was covered with blood. That blood represented the atonement, the sacrifices that were made for the sins of the people to allow them to come into the temple courts. The cross of Jesus is that altar for us. The shed blood on the cross of Jesus is what God looks on and says, come on in. Come on in. Jesus finished that on the cross through his shed blood so that we might be able to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I close with this. Psalm 100. It says this. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. You know, that was written a long time ago, but you know what? It's all the more real today. Shout for joy to the Lord. You shout for joy to the Lord. You know why? Because if you're a Christian, you are going to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Awesome. Awesome. Live like it. Live with that hope continually before you. Live with that continual awareness of the fact that his goodness and mercy have followed you all the days of your life. That regardless of what you're going with, God has promised that he would be with you, and he's faithful to do it. And he's done exactly that. Why? Because you're going to end up dwelling in the house of the Lord forever. You know what? You're good. You're good. Live like it. Live with that reality. Live with that message. Live with that knowledge that the God who said, I love you and I die for you, has now said, I'll see you for all eternity. Rejoice now.